Hello and welcome to Round O Round We Go. I'm Emily, I use she and they pronouns.
And I'm Paul, and I use he and him pronouns.
And today we are looking at Kensal Green Station. Alright, so Kensal Green. First of all, as a side note, I am definitely going to accidentally call it Kensal Rise multiple times. I use Kensal Rise Station a lot and very infrequently use Kensal Green, so it's just where my brain automatically goes. So apologies in advance. Kensal Rise Station, which for those unaware is on the London Overground, was originally called Kensal Green. So maybe it was my brain is rooted in some history that I didn't know about previously. But the station, I think we found a lot about this station.
Yeah, it's one of those slightly surprising stations again, I think, isn't it? It doesn't look like there's going to be a huge amount of stories to tell about it, and then it turns out there's more than you might expect.
Yeah, there's an awful lot. I misremembered it when we were talking at the end of the last episode as looking like one of those district line sort of nondescript red brick stations. It actually looks very different than that. But yeah. I did remember the bad Canadian flag well. And if you are a fan of badly drawn flags, just Google map the hostel that's across the street from there. Or even like the Japanese flag, the proportions are off. I'm like, that one's not that hard. The ones that are just stripes, the proportions are off. It's impressive how bad those flags are. But I think we should jump into the station.
Kensal Green Station opened on the 1st of October 1916. It's served by the London Underground Bakerloo line and also the London Overground. Kensal Green is in Fare Zone 2 and in the London Borough of Brent. In 2019, Kensal Green Station served 2.49 million passengers. Kensal Green Station, sadly, is not accessible. It has steps down from the station entrance to the platforms. There's no lift provided, which is slightly surprising. We'll get onto that later, given that the station was rebuilt in the late 1970s. The station was designed by architect James Wyatt, and its name origin is from the word Kinnigsholt, which I'm probably mispronouncing, which it was recorded as in 1255 and means King's Wood, and that has evolved into Kensal. The green bit was recorded by 1550 and refers to a green just south of the station, which now includes Kensal Green Cemetery. Kensal Green Station is served by buses 18 and N18, and the Labyrinth in the station is number 50 out of 270 and can be found in the ticket hall.
There's not many other places. It's the ticket hall or the platform in Kensal Green.
Yeah, that's about it, really.
So I was excited about Kensal Green because it was, we were getting away from all this sort of district line going, who owned this railway first? Who owned this railway second? I'm like, it's straight Bakerloo line. Of course it isn't straight Bakerloo line. There are a lot of old railway companies that are made up of a lot of letters in the history of this station. So do you want to get into a bit of how this all started?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that complicated a history.
I know it's not that.
Some of them.
I know it's not that complicated, but I just want to draw out like a Victoria line station and be like, this was a Victoria line station. Not that there's only one station.
There's only Pimlico.
There's only one station that ever was just a Victoria line station. Okay, I want a Jubilee line station. Bermondsey. That's what I want. I want Bermondsey. Go ahead.
You should wish for Bermondsey when you pick the next one out. But for Kensal Green Station, its origins kind of lie back in the early 20th century when the Bakerloo line had been built, and it initially ran from Elephant and Castle up to Baker Street when it opened in 1906. And the company that owns the Bakerloo line...
Hold on. It didn't run from just Waterloo to Baker Street? It always went to Elephant Castle? Because why would they call it the Bakerloo line if it didn't run from Baker Street to Waterloo?
Good point. We should probably check this. Hang on.
Okay, we have looked that up now, and actually, interestingly, to both our surprises, it opened between Baker Street and Lambeth North, which was at the time called Kennington Road, but I figure they can't call it the Ken Baker line. I bet if I was named Ken Baker, I'd be excited about it. But
and that bit to Lambeth North opened 10th of March 1906, and then extended it all the way to Elephant and Castle by the 5th of August 1906. It was all under construction at the same time.
Yeah, so it was always going to go to Elephant and Castle. Good, now we've clarified that. Let's continue.
And the Baker Castle line wouldn't sound right either.
That sounds fun. I like that. It's a castle full of baked goods. This is what I want in life. Anyway, let's go back to
returning
Kensal Green.
to the story.
Yes.
So, initial Bakerloo line basically terminated up at Baker Street. Then in 1907 it was extended to Marylebone and Edgware Road. But they wanted to extend it further north to serve the sort of further out suburbs, same as the Charing Cross, Euston, Hampstead line that they'd also built already went all the way up to Hampstead. But the underground group wasn't quite sure where would be the best direction to extend it. They definitely wanted to go to Paddington Station, which is just a little bit further away from Baker Street. Yeah. Because obviously it's a major mainline terminus. There'd be lots of passengers wanting to go.
They assumed the GWR would be super into it.
Exactly. So the GWR, they owned Paddington Station, and in fact they got into a bit of a standoff because the underground group really hoped that the Great Western Railway would be so keen to have a tube line that they would pay for the Bakerloo line to be extended to Paddington. And meanwhile, the Great Western Railway really thought that the Bakerloo line would be so keen to serve Paddington that they would pay for the extension. And so nobody did anything because they were both hoping the other would pay for it.
I love that.
And eventually the standoff was resolved by a completely different mainline railway company, the London and North Western Railway. And they were the company which ran all the mainline trains out of Euston up towards Birmingham, including what had been the very first intercity railway serving London, which was the original London-Birmingham Railway, which opened in 1837. And the thing was, because they were such an early one of these mainline railways serving London, they had entirely focused on intercity traffic. They hadn't got any conception at the time of the idea of suburban traffic, of people, just travelling 5-10 miles out of the city back and forth every day. And their sort of first station out of Euston was all the way down to Harrow and then Watford, and they had these express trains hurtling through, and even by the 1870s they had a few more stations on the route all the way to... So they had 7 stations on the route between Euston and Watford, which is about 1 every 4 kilometres.
But that's not the rate of like a tube line where you've got 1 every kilometre.
They were only served by trains every 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
So basically useless for the local passengers.
Yeah.
And they were kind of fine with that because they were making lots of money on their intercity trains until they noticed that all these suburbs started springing up in the early 20th century.
Yeah, when you look at sort of Metroland, kind of these developments built around these suburban railways.
Exactly. Yeah. They were being built where the Metropolitan line was, not where their railway was. They realised they were losing money. And the London North Western Railway decided they would actually take a fairly radical step of they would build effectively a complete new electric suburban railway parallel to their main line that would start off at Watford right up kind of on the far north outskirts of London. Mm-hmm. And there'd be 2 brand new tracks that would have electric commuter trains on that would serve lots and lots of stations, 16 intermediate stops all the way down to Euston.
And it seemed effective. I mean, that's what they started doing other places. Like when we were talking about Upney, they'd done the same thing there a few years later.
Exactly.
So yeah, it definitely was something that worked and people started jumping on. And it's still really the idea between, well, for lots of transport planning today, like HS2 and stuff, that's really some of the idea behind it.
Yeah, you have the fast lines, then you have the slow lines with the local trains on. It was a great idea. And what they actually had that was almost a bit radical, really, was that they were going to have, rather than the new trains going and terminating in the platforms at Euston and then having to reverse to go the other way, what they would have is a big reversing loop in a tunnel underneath Euston. So the trains coming in, they would dive into tunnels, they would kind of go round a curve, stop at some platforms underneath Euston Station, and then keep on going in the same direction, but go round the loop and head back out, so you wouldn't need to keep stopping and going the other way, which is really efficient, but would also cost a lot of money and require a lot of tunnelling. And having proposed this plan, the London and North Western Railway then came up with another idea, which is, instead of dig this loop underneath Euston, what if they actually sent the trains to 3 different directions? Those 3 directions would be, because they didn't have enough platforms in Euston for all of the suburban trains, they didn't really want to build a giant tunnel under Euston, that's expensive. Instead, what happened was they took over another railway company called the North London Railway, and that ran trains into Broad Street Station, which was a terminus right in the City of London next to Liverpool Street. Mm-hmm. And it had a junction at Primrose Hill with the London North Western Railway's main line.
Yeah.
And that meant they could then run some of their new suburban trains would go off this junction and they'd go into Broad Street, and that meant the London North Western commuters could go straight to the city, which is where
what they want to send people to. Yeah,
exactly. So really great to generate revenue and commuter passengers. They would also send a few of their trains straight into the mainline platforms at Euston, which could cope with a few trains. Yeah. And then they would connect up to an extension of the Bakerloo line, which meant some of the trains would go straight from Watford all the way down through the Bakerloo line and to Elephant and Castle.
Yeah.
Which is a fantastic idea. It's almost sort of Crossrail-like. It's feeding mainline trains into a tunnel under the city.
For sure.
Except that out the other end, it doesn't kind of keep on further south, which has eluded the Bakerloo line ever since, really.
It'll get there someday. That's the dream.
One day. And so what would happen is the Bakerloo line would be extended north, onwards to Paddington, and then it would carry on going up to Queen's Park and connect onto the London North Western Railway's new commuter line and run, sharing the tracks between the tube trains and the new electric suburban trains up to Watford Junction. And the Bakerloo line absolutely loved this idea. The Underground group said, yes, please, especially because the London North Western Railway was going to give them £1 million as a loan with very low interest to pay for their new work, which was fantastic because the Underground group was always short on money, so money was great.
So the London North Western trains would go to Broad Street.
Yep.
They'd go to Euston, but it would only be Bakerloo line trains that would run into the Bakerloo line. That was their plan, or were they originally planning to write small trains that would use the Bakerloo line?
No, they were always hoping that the Bakerloo line would provide all the trains that would run through, except they actually did own some of the Bakerloo line trains. So they had something which was called the Watford Joint Stock, which was basically Bakerloo line trains, some of which were owned by the Bakerloo line, some of which were owned by the London North Western Railway, and they were the ones that ran all the way along this extension to Watford.
Yeah.
But
we'll get into that on later episodes for this line, because there are lots of stations on this bit of the Bakerloo line that we'll want to save some things for instead.
We'll leave the story of those trains for later.
We don't want to pack it all into Kensal Green. We got to have some goodies to sprinkle out over the next 10 years when we finally finish all of these stations.
So they started building these new tracks for the London and North Western Railway. The Bakerloo line started digging their tunnels northwards. They got to Paddington in 1913 and carried on constructing. And so the bit as far as Queen's Park, opened by the 11th of February of 1915. And of course, this was by the time that the First World War had broken out, which took a lot of the sort of money away, and lots of the people who'd be building the railway were now in the army instead, and that slowed down the construction a bit. So eventually the Bakerloo line made it to running the trains to Willesden Junction by the 10th of May of 1915, and then they took right up until 1917 on the 16th of April before they managed to start running the Bakerloo line trains all the way to Watford, so that took a little bit longer. And then at the same time, the London North Western Railway, they were starting to run their new trains on the new tracks that they were building for their new suburban trains. And in fact, they kind of had built the tracks, but not the electrifications. They started off running steam trains on the new tracks for a little bit till they finished that off, and they then dug their tunnels that would take the trains kind of underneath Primrose Hill and into Euston Station. And that took up until 1922 before they started running the trains into Euston for the new electric commuter lines.
And these services are still known as the Watford DC lines to this day, because they are the lines running to Watford, and they run electric trains which run on DC current.
But Kensal Green was kind of lagging behind. It took a little bit longer to build the new station at Kensal Green than Willesden Junction and Queen's Park on the Bakerloo line. That didn't open until the 1st of October 1916, which is possibly why the original station looked a bit different.
Yeah, the original station building looked very much... Well, you have two stations at North Wembley and what was the other one?
Harlesden Station.
Harlesden, yeah, which are virtually the same and also have that look that I was remembering, that kind of... Not exactly the same as those Far East District line stations, but a similar, just small red brick building. But the Kensal Green one was slightly grander, slightly sort of more of a corner plot. And I think we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail when we talk about the station. But it was a little bit of an oddity on that line and came a little bit later.
Yeah, something I think's kind of interesting about the design, the new railways, is I mean, first of all, the trains were interesting because...
You think all trains are interesting.
Exactly. I always think trains are interesting.
Yeah.
But it was intriguing in that this was the very early days of the Undergrounds, these 3 lines that were owned by the Underground Group, the Bakerloo line, the Hampstead Tube, which is now the Charing Cross branch, the Northern Line, and the Piccadilly line. And they were able to swap the trains around between the different lines in a way that's a bit more flexible than we can now, when tube trains are pretty much mostly stuck on one line for their lives.
Yeah, with the exception of sort of the Met Circle, Hammersmith and City District thing. They're all kind of stuck in one place.
So when they opened the first bit of the sort of extension north up as far as Paddington, they realised they needed some new trains, so they got some new motor cars, because the trains at the time, they kind of had definite motor carriages, which had the driver's cab and they had the electrical equipment, and then all the other carriages were basically just empty trailer carriages with seats in for the passengers. So they bought some new motor carriages, which were actually unique in that they were the first ones to be built in Britain. All the previous ones had been built in places like France and Hungary and the USA. And they were built by Brush in Loughborough. But they then nicked the trailer carriages from other tube lines. I think they nicked them off the Piccadilly line because they didn't have as many passengers on the Piccadilly line as they were expecting, as they had lots of spare trailer carriages around. And then when they opened all the way up to Willesden via Kensal Green, again, they needed more trains for this extension, but they just took motor cars and trailer cars all from the Piccadilly line because the Piccadilly just didn't have as many passengers as was hoped for.
Yeah, I mean, the Piccadilly is... still to this day, and they've closed a lot of stations, is just so overpopulated with stations compared to so many of the other lines, particularly this sort of far north. I mean, Kensal Green and Queen's Park aren't that far from one another, but it is a walk. It's not like they're just... It's not, a Covent Garden and Leicester Square kind of situation.
And the other quite interesting thing about the extension is, because it was running along a main line, it didn't have the kind of colour light signalling initially that you'd expect on the London Underground. So when the deep tube lines, like the Bakerloo, had first opened, they had what for the time was very advanced signalling, which is almost the same as the signalling that's still on the Bakerloo line to this day.
Oh, the poor Bakerloo line.
Red and green colour lights, and then they've got the tripcock system, which is basically a fail-safe system, so that if the trains go past a red signal, there's a sort of kind of arm that comes up from the track and it hits a valve on the train and it makes it stop before it crashes into the train in front.
It's a poor Bakerloo line. It's got the old signals, it's got the old trains. It's a bit downtrodden.
It is. I love the Bakerloo.
I know, I love the Bakerloo line
really
too.
Cool one to ride
I love
on.
it.
But that was the advanced signalling system for the day back in the early 20th century. The main line wasn't initially equipped with that. When they built this brand new pair of suburban tracks with electrification, very advanced for the day, the signalling was all the old-fashioned semaphores, which were great big sticks with an arm on the top that goes up or down to show whether the train should go or not. And they had to be controlled from 21 signal boxes along the track, which is an awful lot of signal boxes, all with signal men in pulling the very big levers to control the signals. And that was okay at the start, but after a few years, as the number of passengers increased, the number of trains increased, by the 1930s, the chief signal engineer decided that they needed a much more modern signalling system. And they actually got a very advanced, for the day, automatic signalling system with colour lights, which meant that they only needed 8 signal boxes instead of 21. And they were intriguingly a type we don't really see today of signals, which were called searchlight signals, where if you look at a standard railway signal, it's a bit like a traffic light, with, the red and the green and the yellow lights sort of stacked on top of each other.
Yeah. And
instead what they had was a single lens which could show all 3 colours.
Oh, that's cool.
Which,
yeah, that's even unusual. If you something like theatre lighting, that's quite modern for something like that. And that's something that needs a lot of colours, but you used to just have a lot of sort of gels put in front of lights. But yeah, that's really interesting.
And they would use that to show, whether the trains, they had quite a complicated system of different colours that could be shown in codes, basically, to tell the trains what to do, which you really need a diagram to explain. So if you're really interested in that, go look it up and find a diagram. I won't attempt to explain it on a podcast. But it also had a feature that the trains, if they came to a red signal and then it was red for too long, the drivers were allowed to go slowly past it until they got to the train in front, which increased the capacity because you could basically have queues of trains all sitting behind each other, rather than them having to stay further apart.
I mean, it sounds like a good idea, but if then someone misses a signal, then you've got a
Indeed.
Cascade of trains. And there was an incident in 1986 where you did have, thankfully, only minor injuries to passengers, where you did have two trains colliding, which was meant to be found. It was a driver fault, but there was some debate back and forth when they did the inquiry about the signaling system and how that it was a difficult thing for drivers to use, but it was still found that the driver was at fault for that.
Yeah, that was a case when a mainline train ran into the back of one of the tube trains, which it also indicates the risk of having mainline-sized trains and tube trains, which were a lot lower, running on the same tracks, because you got a situation where basically the mainline train kind of climbed up on top of the tube train, which is potentially very dangerous. But fortunately, 23 people were injured, but nobody killed and nobody seriously injured, so not as bad as it could have been in that case.
Definitely. So if we look at the features of the station itself, I know we mentioned a bit the older features and the sort of change, but this original brick building was, again, as we said before, different than North Wembley and Harlesden, a little bit grander, but it was decided in the 1970s that this building needed to be redone. Yeah,
and it was looking very run down by the time. There's a quote from the Underground News, some newsletter of the London Underground Railway Society in 1979, in which they say that Kensal Green must surely qualify for one of the worst conditioned stations in the London area served by London transport trains, being badly vandalised, none working indicators, and covered with graffiti. And it was also...
Did you really have to roll your R's for that graffiti? That was the most pompous accent. You can just quote something without making...
Quotes always have to sound pompous when they're from the past.
Okay, fine. All right, I'll accept that.
Everyone was pompous in the past.
Yes, that's it. We didn't have anyone working class in the past. Everyone was...
Yes.
That's the history we do here, isn't it? Anyway, so the new building was designed by James Wyatt, who we don't really know much about.
If you Google him, you'll find a lot about him, but what you'll discover is that he's an architect from the 18th century who designed lots of posh country houses, not an architect who designed stations for British Rail in the 1970s. So if there is anything about the 70s one, he's hidden by the historic one.
Yeah, and it followed the Essex Design Guide, which was a bit strange to me because it's nowhere near Essex, but I guess it was an influential design guide for design at the time.
Yeah, it's a design manual by Essex Council, which is therefore called the Essex Design Guide. It looks to me like it's a bit of a reaction against the earlier brutalist and before that modernist designs for public buildings, saying they wanted to go back to something that looks a bit more traditional and looks actually quite stereotypically sort of Metroland, suburban style, with lots of brick and wood and... I mean, to me, the new station, it looks like a church hall, to be honest, or a posh doctor's surgery, or something like that.
An ugly church hall. I don't think it's a particularly attractive building, and I don't think it feels like it's a reaction to modernism and brutalism. It feels like it has elements of that. It feels like a sort of wooden shed that someone put up. It's an interesting building. It doesn't look like any other underground stations, and that's noted in a lot of places. Yeah. And there's a really interesting picture. It's on the Wikipedia page. You can find it. Because the old station is just to the right. If you're looking at the station, it's just to the right of where the new station is. So there's a station of the old one still there and the new one being built just before it opens, with a big sign that says Richard Devine, and a guy there dressed very divinely that I believe is Richard Devine. But I'm not sure.
He's probably not.
Yes. I have no idea who Richard Devine is, but I got a little bit obsessed with the idea. But yeah, it is really interesting to see those two stations beside one another and that very big change.
Yeah. So the old station was a very classic, sort of late Victorian, early 20th century, brick, solid-looking station building. And the new one, I mean, it's like brick at the bottom, and then it's kind of overlapping black wooden planks higher up, pitched roof.
It's not attractive, it's not interesting, but it's so different than any other station I know of or have seen. And it's interesting to me that I didn't remember it. I think, it's probably because I've just hopped in it a few times, but that is because it wasn't built as an underground station.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It wasn't built by London Transport, because actually up until 2007, Kensal Green Station was owned by British Rail, or Network Rail, once privatisation took place, because it had been built by the London North Western Railway on their new suburban lines, which some Bakerloo trains also happened to use, basically. And they owned it, and then it passed onwards to
London Midland and Scottish Railway, and then British Rail on nationalisation, and then I guess Railtrack on privatisation, and now Network Rail, but it was owned very much by the mainline company, not by the London Underground. And that was the case up until 2007, which is when there was a bit of a change to the mainline services there as well.
Yeah, the thing that happens if you Google the station and you get its Wikipedia page, it talks a lot about the murder of Thomas Ap Rees-Price, which is a really horrific and senseless murder. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but the murder was heavily politicized. It happened right outside the station in conjunction with a mugging that happened at the station. Lots of political accusations around that, a lot of incredibly racist discussion going around that. It was actually quite horrific to read for something that happened in 2006, the kind of things that were being said. But that was highly politicized, both in Parliament and from a London level with Ken Livingstone. A lot of criticism was put towards Silverlink for their lack of safety and security at their stations, which sort of snowballed into that being transferred over to...
So Silverlink was the private railway company which ran the suburban services through Kensal Green station at the time. And they got a lot of flack because they didn't have any staff in the station a lot of the time. It seemed to have quite a lot of crime. And all of the services, I think, which were run by the little suburban services run by Silverlink, they all looked very run down, very few people using them at the time. They weren't attractive trains to be travelling on. They were unpleasant stations for passengers to be using. And that was kind of, it was at that time that that criticism of Silverlink kind of built into the transfer of all of their services to London Overground, which happened in November 2007.
Yeah.
And that's when Transport for London took over that huge swathe of suburban services and started off the creation of the Overground brand, and that culminated in the vast Overground network that we have today, when many more services have been taken over by Overground as well.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to point out about the station building, because you mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but we were having an interesting discussion about this before we started recording, the fact that the new building was opened either 1979 or 1980. Paul has spent hours trying to figure out the exact date and can't get a primary source on that. So if you do know, you can get a primary source on that, let us know, because we've seen both. But I was surprised for a station that was opened at that time, the lack of accessibility. I would think if you were going to redo a station booking hall, and a station where accessibility would not be very difficult, you could, it's just a platform, a few steps down to the platform, you could put a lift in there. But you were saying that priority wasn't necessarily there yet, particularly around British Rail.
Yeah. I mean, it was, from my knowledge of the matter, it was kind of through the 80s that there started to be a lot more focus on accessibility for public transport. And it wasn't really until at least into the later 80s with the Docklands Light Railway that they started making brand new stations all be fully accessible with lifts, and it kind of took a bit longer until, I guess it was like the 90s when buses started to have low floor access, and the big move to converting stations to have level access has been even later than that, through the 90s and 21st century. So it looks surprising now, but that sadly was the way at the time. It just wasn't the priority we'd hoped for.
I mean, I think it's shocking to me how recent those things were, and how obviously there was a ton of activism around access and things like that from the disabled community throughout the sort of 50s, 60s and 70s, but it took a long time for that to actually happen. So it's sad too, because of course if they'd made it about 5-10 years later, the new station, you would have had access there. But the Bakerloo line trains themselves are not particularly accessible anyway, so there might have been other...
And in fact you get an awkward situation, because you've got the Bakerloo line trains and the mainline trains sharing platforms. Mm-hmm. And of course the Bakerloo line, it's a tube line, it's got really low floors on the trains compared with the height of the main line, which means from the platform you've got a big step up into the mainline trains and then a step down into the Bakerloo line trains.
Yeah, but I mean you can put in ramps and things and organize
downwards
it.
Ramps are really difficult.
Yeah, and of course safety-wise those are a problem. So it's unfortunately, it's just not a great situation, but access generally on the underground is unfortunately not particularly great of a situation.
No.
But The other thing to point out is that you do still have a lot of the features from the opening of the station on the platforms themselves. So you get a little bit, not a lot, but you've got the same platform canopies, or presumably they've redone the canopies. But
they're the same structures from 1916.
And there's some little sort of curved gutters that are built into the concrete at the back. I mean, this is niche, but there were people, we found things that were quite excited about that, literally pictures in books of going, oh, look, these aren't anywhere else on the network. So you do have those. And yeah, these sort of red platforms, it is an interesting and odd station within the underground network. Now, this station is particularly interesting in what maybe could be around it, near it, what its future could look like. Probably not the station itself, but the general area.
Yeah, and it's an area which is likely to be massively transformed in the next few decades by High Speed 2.
Yeah, and it's an area that generally has gentrified like mad over the past, 10, 20 years. Even when I moved to London, 10 years ago, I lived near that area and it looks so different today. And we were talking to my friend Arian, who grew up in that area, and him just saying every time he grew up in Queen's Park, we might have him on for Queen's Park when we ever draw it out. But he was saying, that area has gentrified so much, and when he goes back, he doesn't even recognize it. So there's that going on. And of course, that councils think, maybe we can get some more transport. And of course, that's what people want in the area.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, that's definitely going to happen. Just a little way over to the southwest of Kensal Green Station is Old Oak Common, which at the moment is kind of a massive railway depot that's busily becoming a massive building site, because it's soon going to become a station on High Speed 2. And I have to say, Kensal Green is not going to be the closest tube station to Old Oak Common, probably. That will either be Willesden Junction, one stop along the Bakerloo line, or it'll be North Acton on the Central line. But it's going to take so long, both for us to do this podcast and for the station to be built, we thought we might as well mention it now. And
if the station is ever built, we never know.
They're busily on work at the moment. Yeah. It's underway. It's happening. But it means we can come back to it a few times, probably over the years, as we keep referring to the other stations.
Yeah.
And it is going to be massive. It's going to take a long time to build. So the High Speed 2, for anybody not familiar with that, it's a brand new high-speed main line, which is going to go
Are we going to dig into High Speed 2 controversy? Okay,
let's ignore the controversy over it. It goes from Euston up to Birmingham and to other cities in northern England. Might get extended even further. It is very expensive. There's a big controversy about that. Look it up if you want to know all the full details. But I'm
sure most of our listeners will already have strong opinions on the matter.
Probably. And in fact, Old Oak Common kind of comes into that controversy for a bit that I'll mention in a moment, because it's going to be a huge station. It's going to have 6 platforms for the high-speed trains, which are going to be in an 850-metre long box, 20 metres deep and 70 metres wide, which is pretty colossal. There's then going to be another 8 platforms for the express trains on the Great Western Main Line, which it runs parallel to, and also for Crossrail trains. And there might be some platforms for the Chiltern mainline trains as well, because they need more platforms and they can't fit them into Marylebone. They might go and build them at Old Oak Common.
This sounds like they're building like a Clapham Junction.
It is going. It's the largest. Huge. It's the largest mainline station ever built as a single project.
Wow.
Yeah, it's going to have 34 staircases, 44 escalators, and 52 lifts.
52 lifts.
52 lifts.
Well, that really bumps up our accessibility there. That's great. But 50... What?
They're expecting 250,000 passengers per day. It's vast.
I mean, I guess... But is it even connected to the underground?
Well, you see, this is the interesting thing, because it's not going to have a direct underground connection according to the current plans. It will be on Crossrail, so you can, whiz straight into central London very fast on that. There is a proposal that the overground have some new stations constructed on it, which will be called Old Oak Common Lane and Hythe Road, which will be kind of built onto slight variations to the existing overground lines. But obviously people say, well, actually, we ought to have an underground station. Everybody likes the underground, and especially transport planners. Yeah. And there is a suggestion which I've seen only in one book. It doesn't seem to be in any kind of current documents or news or anything like that, but somebody must have considered it at some point, which is that Kensal Green Station be closed and a loop be built down from Queen's Park Station that would kind of curve south and then go through Old Oak Common and then go back north and then rejoin to go on to Willesden Junction, which would then serve Old Oak Common and get that onto the Bakerloo line, and maybe even get it onto the overground line that goes through Old Oak Common, or that goes through Kensal Junction as well, but Kensal Green as well.
I mean, they could be a sort of out-of-station interchange, but still, you'd think if you're doing that much work, you kind of want to connect them all up. But it's just such a massive project for an area that seems very suburban and not necessarily that dense. I mean, there is population.
No, there's a massive project. It's called the Old Oak Common Development Committee.
So there's lots of flats being built.
Where basically there's a huge sort of area of light industry which is going to be swept away and replaced with, lots and lots and lots of flats. Not quite as many as they hoped for, because there's a massive car sales place called Car Giant that they were hoping to turn into flats as well. But it turns out they actually make a lot of money and serve a lot of people and provide a lot of jobs. They've said, no, we don't want to be turned into flats, and they've been successful in that so far.
That's good. Yeah. Someone fighting back. I'm not thrilled that it's cars that are fighting back, but someone fighting back to these flat developments. But at the same time, of course, I mean, I am so for building housing, but of course, I doubt these flats are going to be affordable housing and things like that. Or
I'm sure they say they will be. But
truly affordable housing. I mean, that's its own debate that we don't need to get into. But it's just so interesting to me because Northwest London was the first part of London I lived in, and I lived in Northwest London for about 4 years, and it feels very close to my heart. But it is one of those places that feels like sort of an ignored bit of London. Mm-hmm. I remember when I first moved to Neasden and no one had ever heard of where that was. Even when I lived in Hampstead, well, not Hampstead, West Hampstead, which is quite different than Hampstead, sort of Kilburn area, it just felt like an area people don't know. And this may shape that. I think this may, I know so many people who know East London, North London, South East London, South London, not quite Southwest London, but the sort of, I just feels like an unknown area, and that might shape that and change that. And I like that because I have a really big place in my heart for Northwest
London. And I think
London.
so much of the redevelopment of London has focused on, first of all, the Canary Wharf area with the docks, and then it's moved further east to Stratford with the Olympics, and it now does seem to be shifting towards that western area with the Old Oak Common development, and with Crossrail serving the west of London as well.
You and I, based on our sort of age and demographic profiles, get a lot of ads for flats in our Instagram feed and things like that. And a lot of them do seem to be selling places like Harrow, which granted is a little bit farther north, but that area does seem to be sort of, well, kind of northwest, but that area does seem to be kind of developing around that.
Now, I did actually mention, talking of the development around there, and I've mentioned the controversy over High Speed 2. So one of the things that people complain about with High Speed 2 is that it will require a massive redevelopment of Euston Station to fit the high-speed trains in there. That will be very expensive, take a very long time, and Old Oak Common Station is being designed so that, in theory, it could serve as the terminus of High Speed 2, and the trains could just stop there and not go any further. Now, the plan is that it's just there as a kind of contingency, so that if they still haven't finished building Euston, when the high-speed trains start running, they can use Old Oak Common, or if there's engineering works, they can use Old Oak Common. But some people say, hey, why not just not bother with Euston at all and just terminate at Old Oak Common?
That is an interesting idea. Even if not all the trains terminated there, some of them could, but it doesn't feel like a very central location for things to terminate. But maybe it could shift where we think of the centre of London towards sort of Baker Street and Marylebone. Because, when I lived in Neasden, I said, it's only about 15 minutes to get to central London, to get to Baker Street. And people would always be like, oh, that's not really central London. But it is.
The thing is, a huge proportion of people coming out of Euston walk to their final destination at the moment.
Yeah.
And if everybody, other than people who wanted to get to what's quite a long way west, had to get on Crossrail or whatever other services there are, it would overwhelm them. So
exactly.
Euston makes more sense.
Can you imagine a station, a little dinky station like Kensal Green, taking in all these people if it became... Willesden Junction's quite a big station, but that's a station that there's more space, but it's quite overwhelmed with the number of people who change there just on the overground. So I can't imagine the lines here taking on a lot more people.
So talking of Crossrail stations, especially, there is a proposal for another Crossrail station to be built nearby, as well as the one at Old Oak Common, which is an addition to the kind of initial Crossrail line. And that is that Kensington and Chelsea Council want there to be a station which is going to be called Kensal Portobello Station. And that would kind of come in between Paddington Crossrail Station and either Acton Main Line, which is going to be the next station to the west as it opens, or kind of between Paddington and Old Oak Common once Old Oak Common is built. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be kind of near, it's on a road called Canal Way, which is basically near a gasworks or an old gasworks and a Sainsbury's car park.
Yeah, it's the big Sainsbury's. I know, I can picture exactly where it is, and the canal, and where Innocent is based, what they call Fruit Towers. I can picture it right there, the Ladbroke Grove Sainsbury's, yeah.
That's Innocent Smoothies, the smoothie company is based around there. Yeah. And it's basically, the council have been lobbying Network Rail and Crossrail and saying, we'd really like an extra station because it will serve all the people who live around here, and it would be just sort of to the south of Kensal Green Station. So, not directly connected, but very much in the local area. Their estimates from 2012 say it cost £33 million. So by now, probably add a zero on the end of that. I don't think it's very likely to happen, especially with another station at Old Oak Common just a little bit to the west. It seems a lot of stations to fit into not very long a distance.
Yeah.
But, good for them if they want more stations.
Yeah, lovely for them. And yeah, I mean, that is a bit of a dead area for stations. I know I've spent, reasonable amount of time walking around that area, and it is kind of a gap, and a lot of the buses go through there, but there aren't a lot of stations just by the canal there. So it's an interesting proposal, and an area that could, I think, economically benefit from that if you get more people coming and going. Speaking of dead, I knew you, when I said dead station, you were like, or dead area, you had this. Of course, we want to talk about the Kensal Green Cemetery, which is a very, very famous cemetery in the area. Many people will know it just south of the station, actually not in Brent. The station is in Brent, but it's in Kensington and Chelsea. It was the first large commercial cemetery in London in 1833. Obviously, with the Industrial Revolution, you get a lot more people living and dying in London, and they needed places to put them, and the churchyards and the few cemeteries that already existed just didn't quite cut the mustard. I don't know. I've never used that idiom before. I don't know where it came from, but anyway, that came out. So in 1833, it was built. Now, there's some quite amusing stories about this. So there was a competition to design it, and it was won by a man named Henry Edward Kendall. But the chairman of the board building the cemetery didn't like his designs, so he got his surveyor, John Griffith, to draw up a new design, and they used it instead. The cruel irony of the situation is that though Henry Edward Kendall never got his design he never got his design of the cemetery built, he was in fact buried there. So, it's a bit cruel, but it was what it was. It is part of the Magnificent Seven cemeteries. You might know of the Magnificent Seven. They are 7 large Victorian cemeteries in London, which are sort of considered these beautiful held up cemeteries, and it was the first of them, and the friends of Kensal Green Cemetery call it the doyen of the Magnificent Seven. I didn't know the word doyen. It means sort of the grandest or the most important or the best one. Of course, the friends of Kensal Green Cemetery would say that, but it is, it's a pretty incredible cemetery, a large space, and lots of famous people buried there. So I made some notes. If you go to the Friends of Kensal Green Cemetery, the list is almost endless, but I made some notes on a few people. So I put Daniel Maclise. You probably don't know who Daniel Maclise is unless you happen to be a tour guide of Parliament, but I used to, and some of my friends who are tour guides might be listening, so I threw that in for them. He did a lot of the paintings around Parliament. You have the Brunels, both Mark Brunel and Isabard Kingdom Brunel, of course, very, very famous, particularly railway engineers around London and west of London. William Makepeace Thackeray, who wrote Vanity Fair, among other things. Marigold Frances Churchill, who was the daughter of Winston Churchill, died at the age of 3. She's buried there. Charles Babbage, the sort of first computer, kind of what would be described as the creator of the first computer.
Certainly very early mechanical computer.
Yes. It's debatable, as many things are. Though admittedly, half of his brain is at the Hunterian Museum and half of it is at the Science Museum, so his whole intact body was not buried there. The dramatist Harold Pinter is there, as well as Terence Rattigan, and W.H. Smith, who, of course, started his business, W.H. Smith's, and very much associated with railways. There are also a fair number of people who were cremated there. There is Ingrid Bergman, Freddie Mercury, and there is a post to him there, a sort of small little post in his birth name, recognizing him. Alan Rickman and Christine Keeler were all cremated there. And actually, I looked at, it's still a working cemetery. You can go on their website and look at the list of, what the costs around all of that are. To get a new front row grave there is £25,000. So it's expensive to die, as they say. It's a pretty big cost, but the other costs in terms of cremation and sort of other things like that are...
What's a front row grave?
So it's like one on one of the big pathways.
Oh, I see.
So, like when we go walking around the graveyard,
Yeah.
it's the ones you actually notice, essentially,
Right, okay.
as opposed to the ones that you have to sort of step over other people's graves or go through a sort of side pathway to get to. So
we could save money by getting buried further at the back with the worst view, basically.
Yes,
Get the cheap seats.
Yes, we can. But if you get one of those new graves that has a picture of you, like I said, I always wanted a picture of me, like, falling over at 21 and drunk or something on my grave. That would be, no one would see that. Or a picture of you with, like, some trains or something, whatever you want. No one would see that. It's expensive, essentially, to be buried in Kensal Rise Cemetery. I think I probably have some relatives buried there. I've sometimes take a look when I'm in, not Kensal Rise Cemetery, sorry, Kensal Green Cemetery.
You did it.
I know, I did it. I knew, and it wasn't even about the station. But yeah, it's a big cemetery, and logistically, weirdly, the man replacing my boiler a few weeks ago was talking about having his mother's ashes put with his grandparents' grave there, and apparently there's a lot of regulations and logistics around this kind of thing. I don't know anything about it, thankfully, because I've never had to deal with burying anyone. But yeah, it is. There's a lot of logistics. Also, as a final point, the cemetery is mentioned in a John Betjeman poem, the poem Middlesex, which is quite a famous poem of his.
And John Betjeman, of course, quite famous among railway fans because he was the one who wrote about or did the TV programme Metroland and lots of TV programmes about trains, and there's a statue of him in St Pancras Station and all that sort of thing. So
we love a bit of train fans. And the last thing that we want to talk about, which is a bit random, is Holland and Holland. You found this.
Yeah, so I always, like to have a look at a bit of a map as my research for local area when I'm talking about these stations, and something that I noticed on the map for the area around Kensal Green was there's a gun factory right next to it, and that's not something you see every day in London, so I looked into it and discovered it's a very posh company called Holland and Holland, who make guns for extremely rich people for shooting birds and deer and the sort of thing that rich people apparently do for fun. And when I'm saying for rich people, their cheapest gun is £40,000, and they go up to £250,000 or more if you have the kind of custom engraving and art.
I mean, some of the engravings in these guns are incredible. Just looking at their website, like, I have absolutely no interest in guns, but these are the kind of things that show up on. When I was a kid, my mom used to sometimes watch Antiques Roadshow, and the American one is almost all Civil War memorabilia. It's almost all guns, and it's these kind of things that are just the amount of work that go into this engraving is just...
Yeah, and if you're going on the tour of a grand country house, this is the kind of gun that would be hanging on the wall somewhere.
Yeah, these are definitely showpieces.
Yeah.
I'm not sure anyone is necessarily shooting these.
Well, apparently people buy two of them so that they can go shooting, and when they've finished shooting one gun, they hand it to their reloading servant, who hands them the next gun that's already filled. So they don't just spend £250,000, they spend £500,000 on fancy guns.
This is a world I do not understand.
I mean, they are the official gun makers to both Prince Charles and the Duke of Edinburgh, who died died the other week,
but they haven't updated
no.
their website yet. Oh dear.
So it's a very high class of gun manufacturer. They've been going since 1835. They are the epitome of fancy gun makers, basically.
And so random that they're just in Kensal Green.
Yeah.
They also have a shooting range that's in North London. It's within the boundaries of London, which was really interesting. Not a shooting range, like an actual outdoor area you can go shoot. I don't know anything about shooting, so I think we'll leave it at that. But just an interesting point in nearby. That leaves us with our onward connections.
Indeed. Where can we go not by tube?
So, of course, the station is on the overground. So I was tempted by the overground. But I also thought, there's a lot of other stations on this line that are also on the overground. So I stuck with the one and only bus. Well, I guess there's the night bus version of it, but the one and only bus, which is the 18. And I love the 18. It goes from Euston to Sudbury. I mean, it goes from Euston to north of the North Circular. It is a wild, long, curvy bus route. And I love it. I think sometime last summer, sort of when things really started to loosen up, and it was the first bus, just sort of by coincidence, but also the first bus I was like, I'm going to ride a bus just for fun, not to go anywhere, because I haven't done that in such a long time. And so I took that and ended up in a rainstorm on the side of the North Circular trying to catch more buses home and freezing to death, which wasn't a great experience. But the bus itself is just lovely. It takes you through so much of Northwest London. And as I said, I have such a soft spot for Northwest London. So I highly recommend doing the whole journey of the 18.
And of course, if you end up in Sudbury, it's got a famous Charles Holden tube station as well.
So you win both ways. All right. Do we go for our next?
Is it yes?
Our next. I think first we should talk about our little bet we have.
I think we should, shouldn't we? So take your hand out of that bag. No pulling new stations out.
What is our bet, Paul?
Okay, we've got a bit of a discussion going as to how likely is it that we will end up with two adjacent stations at some point. So, we're doing Kensal Green today. Will we, as our next station, end up with Willesden Junction or Queen's Park?
Yes.
Either direction along the line counts. How likely is that at some point in the next 264 stations to go that we will end up with two in a row? And of course, there's a lot of ways to get two in a row stations because there's loads of interchanges on the underground.
So I mean, we could probably figure out that probability ourselves. I mean, neither of us are particularly mathematically talented, but we could probably figure out that probability ourselves if it was just either side. But of course,
it's complicated.
Yeah, Waterloo Station has a lot more possible next ones, and then of course, as we pull out more stations, the chances change and this sort of thing.
Now, I think that we probably will get two stations in a row at some point in the next 264.
And I think we probably won't.
And I've done some maths.
Yeah, Paul, but you got a D in A-level math, so I don't necessarily trust
Well, you see, this is what I was thinking. I thought, it's a long time since I properly studied probability, and I didn't want to start looking through all my old maths books and trying to work out how to calculate that formally. Although if anyone listening can actually come up with a proper formula to work it out, I would love to hear it.
I do know that there are a lot of trainers that are also math nerds, so I think that might cross itself.
But what I do a lot is make spreadsheets, so I did make a spreadsheet to try and calculate it.
Of course you did.
Do you want to see my spreadsheet?
It sounds like an innuendo, but yes, I do want to see the spreadsheet, Paul. I mean, I'm not sure this is going to tell me anything that I understand.
Okay, so...
Oh my god, this is too much, Paul. It's too much.
I'm not brilliant at maths. I can do big spreadsheets. What I did was... Obviously, the underground is very, very complicated. There's 11 different lines, and they all overlap, and they've got loads of different branches with different termini. Mm-hmm. So I didn't try and calculate the probability for the underground as it is. I simplified it to be one long line with 270 stations in a row. Which is a simplification because... On the one hand, all the different termini obviously only have one next station.
Yeah.
So I got rid of all of those, but also all of the junctions and the interchanges have more next stations.
Yeah, there's more junctions and interchanges than there are terminus stations.
So this actually kind of works in favour of it being, well, reality, there's more likely to be multiple adjacent stations than there are with my simplifications. So it works in Emily's favour, so I thought that's a good approach to take. And
very, very chivalrous of you.
Well, otherwise you'd accuse me of bias in my calculations.
I don't even understand this calculation.
So what I did in Excel is I used a formula to put the numbers 1 to 270 into a completely random order in a column.
Yeah.
And then I did that 100 times, so that there are in total 100 columns, all with the numbers 1 to 270 in a random order. Yeah. Next to each of those columns is another column with a formula which notices if there are adjacent numbers or consecutive numbers. So, for example, if it suddenly goes 107, 106, then the next cell will have a 1 in it, and it'll count the number of those. And then there's another formula that counts the number of times that happened. Okay. And the way this spreadsheet works, if you refresh it, it basically redoes all the randomizing. Yeah. So I refreshed it 10 times, so I basically did all the numbers in a row 1,000 times, effectively. So, 100 times 10, 1,000 runs to see what would happen on 1,000 different occasions
if you could see my
of
face
this probability.
Right now.
And I worked out the frequencies of all of those. I put them in one big grid that's got like 10 columns, each with 100 different runs. And so the number of times in that there were no adjacent stations or no consecutive numbers was 134 out of 1,000. For one pair of consecutive numbers, 261 occasions. Yeah. For 265 occasions. So basically, you've got about a 13% chance of there not being any adjacent stations, taking up my approximations for this. There's about the same probability of 4 or more adjacent stations in a 4 or more adjacent stations in a row as there are of no adjacent stations in a row, very roughly.
Okay. So, I want someone to actually who might know this mathematically to figure it out. I'm not saying I'm necessarily right. I just feel like it's unlikely.
Yeah, whereas I feel like there's only a 13% chance of that happening, and therefore I've got about an 87% chance of winning this bet.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're right about this, then you're absolutely right. You do have an 87% chance of winning this bet. Although I don't know if it changes when we take stations out. I don't know if that matters mathematically.
I think that's taken into account by the way that the numbers were put into a row randomly. Okay. So
I think we're probably...
Somebody who can do the proper maths... Let us know.
I think we're probably boring people, and we should pick on the next one, which, oh God, if it's Queen's Park, I'm going to cry. I'm just going to be so embarrassed.
Okay, rustling round. What have we got?
Ooh.
I like that noise.
Hyde Park Corner.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah, that's very exciting. Lots to talk about Hyde Park Corner, and nowhere near Kensal Green. So just saying, we can avoid that one there.
Yes, we can.
So we shall be back and talk about Hyde Park Corner in the not too distant future.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Roundel Round We Go on Kensal Green. We do everything on this podcast ourselves. So it's me, Emily Turner.
And me, Paul Bucket-Gray.
That is except our artwork, which is by the wonderful Colleen McIsaac. You can find them at Little Foible Art on Instagram. You can also find us on Instagram at Roundel Round Pod or on Twitter at Roundel Round Pod. Or you can email us at roundelroundpod@gmail.com. Thank you to Drew on Twitter last week, who told us how to pronounce Becontree. So now when we get to Becontree, I will be saying that correctly, as will Paul, but I was the one most worried about it. So thank you, Drew, for telling us how to pronounce Becontree. Now, the next part of our podcast is where we do our weekly challenge. This is a map-based challenge. You do not need to travel to the stations. We just want you to look at the map and come up with a challenge and get back to us on Instagram or Twitter or by email about how you would make this route happen. So, because we've got Kensal Green, with green in the name, and Hyde Park Corner, with park in the name, we thought we'd make up a Green Park challenge. So for this challenge, what you need to do is get a route between Kensal Green and Hyde Park Corner, which travels through Green Park on all 3 lines that go through Green Park. So essentially, you're going to have to go on the Jubilee, Piccadilly, and Victoria line through Green Park, and not travel more than once on each one of them through Green Park. So you'll have to travel through Green Park 3 times, change, come back, go through Green Park again. So that's the challenge. If you've got a route, please let us know on Instagram, Twitter, or by email.
To end the episode, here are the references that we have used in researching everything about Kensal Green. The books we've used are London Underground Stations in Colour for the Modeller and Historian by John Glover, Building London's Underground by Antony Badsey-Ellis, The History of the Bakerloo Line by Clive D.W. Feather, The Bakerloo Line and Illustrated History by Mike Horne, Labyrinth, A Journey Through London's Underground by Tamsin Dillon, Will Self, Mark Wallinger, Marina Warner, Christian Wolmar, Louise Coysh, Why Do Shepherds Need a Bush? London's Underground History of Tube Station Names by David Hilliam, and What's in a Name? Origins of Station Names on the London Underground by Cyril M. Harris. We also referred to the poem Middlesex by John Betjeman, and we used several websites as well, including referring to the archive of the Underground News from July 2017 and October 1979, an article from Rail Engineer about the station now arriving Old Oak Common Interchange, an article from New Civil Engineer about West London Council in talks about new Crossrail station, and the websites about Kensal Green Cemetery, including the official cemetery website and the website of the Friends of Kensal Green Cemetery. And all the links to those websites and the full publication details of the book can be found in the show notes for this episode on its website.
Thank you for joining us, and hopefully you will join us again next week for Hyde Park Corner.